Okay, for the next section, what we're doing is having a bit of a panel going on. What I'm going to do is, well, I guess you've read the program. This is a panel on open source within software. I've got a bunch of questions that I'm going to be asking these guys, but also we're going to throw it open to you as the audience. So I'm going to ask them easy questions, and you can ask them the hard ones. Before we get started, I think it would be good for you guys to introduce yourselves. So do you want to just go down the line, let people know who you are, and I guess why you're interested in open source, why you're on this panel, where does open source come up in your sort of everyday life?
Sure, thanks, Colin. My name is Gabriele Columbro. I'm the executive director of the Symphony Software Foundation. For those of you who don't know, probably most of you are familiar with Symphony. We are an independent open source foundation who's fostering open source around the Symphony ecosystem. So certainly that's one of the reasons why I'm here on the panel. Open source and financial services is clearly one of the areas that is going to be, is going to be key to our success. Prior to running the foundation, I've worked both in commercial open source. I worked for a company called Alfresco for 8 years, pretty much covering any role, from cleaning the toilets to product management. And I've been involved in mainstream communities. I'm an Apache committer. I am the release manager for the Content Management Interoperability Services project. And that's it.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Frank Tarsillo. I work for IHS Markit. I'm head of architecture for the processing division there. I am been in Markit for about 3 years. Prior to that, this is going to be a Thomson Reuters theme tonight. So 17 years at Thomson Reuters. So I know everyone well in the room. They're from Thomson Reuters. Open source. So I'm part of the engineering steering committee of the Symphony Foundation, Open Source Foundation. I'm a committer, active committer, as people probably know by now. I still like to code, even though I'm a managing director in a very large company. I still like to code every day. I lead a lot of the new initiatives and innovation within IHS Markit related to cloud technologies. You've heard of blockchain, I'm sure. That's the latest and greatest buzz. And other areas that improve the way we develop within the firm.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Nick Kolba. I'm Director of Ecosystem at OpenFin and also an ex-Thomson Reuters person. I don't have as long a tenure at Thomson Reuters as Frank, but I did do about 15 years there and on and off. And my last role there was the Director of Technology for the Icon App Studio. So at OpenFin, one of the things I do is I look after our open source strategy. As well, I've been involved with open source since about 2006, primarily as an advocate, but I led a lot of kind of high-profile integrations into products at Thomson Reuters, including the first kind of public-facing thing into the Reuters product, which was the Dojo Toolkit back in 2006.
Hi, I'm Matt Gardner. I work for BlackRock. Been in fintech for 16 years young. Work mostly as a core architect around our Aladdin platform. Also working a little bit with Symphony. In terms of our open source, I'm one of the more sort of proactive people trying to encourage open source, particularly in financial firms and particularly at BlackRock. And we're heavily involved in some of the Symphony stuff with Frank and the Symphony Open Source Foundation. So that's me.
Great, thanks very much. And as you know already, I'm Colin Eberhardt from Scott Logic. I guess the reason I'm here is I'm quite an advocate of open source, and just like Frank, I'm still very active in writing code, and go and look at my GitHub profile, I'm wasting too much time on there. Don't worry, I'm not texting my wife, I've got the questions on my phone. So let's start off with a little bit of history on open source. I actually spotted on Twitter the other day, I didn't realize the term open source was so recent. It was coined as recently as 1998. So even though the principles are quite old, the term open source is quite new. So I guess my first question to the panel is, how has open source changed for you? So I'm going to start off with Nick. And one of the things you mentioned to me a while back, Nick, was about how open source is now being led by companies rather than individuals. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, actually that was a comment that a speaker at the last FinJS here in New York raised to me, which is just kind of the observation that we've kind of a lot of the big projects, if you look at them now, like React, Angular, et cetera, they're really led by large enterprise companies. And earlier on, certainly where I came from was the DHTML kind of JavaScript world. You know, if you look at the early projects there, they were really community-based. I don't know really what that means, honestly, going forward in the future, but it is kind of interesting. And I think the conversation we had at one point was that, in a way, you could kind of look and see maybe this parallels what you see on the web, where the web started out as this weird, very community-based place, and now it's gone through, you could say, a maturation process where, you know, it's becoming more aligned with the enterprise. And enterprise is realizing, hey, this weird kind of community-based stuff actually has a huge amount of value, and there's a lot of innovation and great stuff happening here, and we want to become more involved. So while I think some people could view that as kind of a selling out, I think it's actually much more of a maturation. I'd love to hear other people's opinion on that.
Well, I guess from my perspective, I think it's quite right. There are big companies leading big open source projects, but I see that as being in addition to rather than replacing the smaller sort of community-led projects. I guess throwing that over to Gab, I mean, how has open source changed from your perspective? You mentioned previously that open source was a sales differentiator, which is a very different angle.
Yeah, I mean, just tapping quickly on what Nicholas said, I was looking at the Black Duck Future of Open Source survey today, and actually, 65% of companies are now contributing to open source. I mean, we all know that adoption of open source has been, pretty much mainstream already. But the interesting thing was that it's actually grew 60% from last year. So it's been a major, change in actually adoption and actually contribution back. So I think it goes to your point. Obviously, as I mentioned, I worked in an enterprise company as well who made business, around open source. I mean, Joe, in a way that does a lot of that around Node.js. Alfresco, my former company, was selling open source, and we had a community version. My impression is that last decade was certainly characterized by open source software as, again, a replacement for more expensive, less open, more complex solutions.
So a quick question, why was Alfresco open source then?
Well, definitely Alfresco was positioning itself, at least for 3 or 4 years, as the open source alternative to SharePoint. And so the element of prevention of vendor lock-in, was already big. My take is that I think to the point of also companies actively now driving open source projects, and not necessarily just product companies like, for example, Alfresco, but even large enterprises like Telco, FinServe, more and more. I do think that there is an element of really driving innovation, which is not just a simple sales differentiator. The way I look at it, open source is not anymore a differentiator, it's more of like a given. If you're not open source, you probably are going to be left behind.
Okay, so Frank, Matt, you've both been in the financial domain for a very, very long time. So interesting to know your perspectives. So start with you, Frank. How has open source changed for you in terms of how you use it?
Was it 98? 98. When it was first
yeah,
one.
are you going to tell me that you were doing it before it was called
not at
open
all.
source?
I was going to say, in 98, we were still looking at large vendors, right? And all we cared about is if you had IBM, or you had Sun, or you had one of these large providers, you were good to go. And now developers have turned that around as open source being first choice. It is the first choice before we look at the vendors and the large enterprises to purchase software. And I think that has changed the culture of how we, actually from a product perspective, build our software and solutions. We're actually looking for support now, oddly enough, in the open source, right? Not with large vendors. So we see this kind of general trend as we go forward into the next few years. Not only are people looking for support in open source, but also contributing back and actually owning the open source. So we're going through a lot of discussions now internally, for instance, to actually source developers out to actually contribute back to the projects that we're consuming.
That's a big change. And how about yourself?
I'd actually echo the same, actually. It's about acceptance. There's been a lot more, like you say, you're going to go out there and you're going to say, let's go and get this piece of software in. Most people turn around and a lot of the arguments we have are about, why don't we go and get this from open source? There's going to be a better way to do it. It's going to be like crowdsourced, a lot of the solutions. A lot of people out there want to be experts in a lot of different subjects. You know you're going to get actually a well thought out project from open source with a lot of support. As long as it's an active project and you choose the right one, you're making a really good decision. And that's a lot of how management and that acceptance of that see it.
Yeah. And staying with yourself, actually, I remember a talk you did a little while back, and you used a really great quote from Isaac Newton on standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about what are the benefits of using open source. So can you elaborate on that quote? Why did you pick it? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think the big way to think about it is it's a positive quote. Otherwise, you're always saying you use open source because you don't want to reinvent the same wheel. You know, we're all solving very similar problems. So you can all go and reinvent the wheel, we can all go and do this. What's the point? Standing on the shoulders of giants is a kind of a positive way of saying it. And it's on the £2 coin. So if you guys know what that is, it's a coin in the UK. It's not worth much now because obviously the strength of the dollar. So I've got a few of them I can throw around. But the big driver around that is you can deliver more, you can deliver quickly. And you think about it, we're under a lot of pressure to deliver an awful lot in the finance industry. Costs are costs, we want to keep them low, we want to move faster, we want to deliver more. Why reinvent the wheel? Why would we not build more together and see more of a collaborative effect across financial institutions? Yeah. And that's one of the big drivers in my book.
Yeah, that's very true. And you mentioned it a number of times, cost, which is why reinvent the wheel. Everyone can relate to that. But I guess I want to talk about some of the other benefits of open source. So Nick, one of the things you mentioned was something about the real cultural aspects of open source. Again, that would be great if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that's actually really huge. So I think that, in fact, a lot of the intangible parts of open source are the greatest value. If you look at GitHub, and you can look at the stats, but any like major open source project out there, you'll see that I think it's probably going to fall around 60% of the commits come from maybe 2% of the people. So sometimes, and when I was at Thomson Reuters, we had a lot of conversations about, can we open source this thing? The expectation, the way it was looked at was, okay, is the ROI in terms of like putting this out there going to be this exchange where we put this out there and the cost of us putting this out there is we got to clean some stuff up, we have to maintain it. Is that going to come back to us in terms of kind of free code contributed back into the project? And while that can happen, I think, and it happens much more in the ecosystem supporting the project, I think the bigger, much bigger value is this kind of cultural aspect where, and I know other people alluded to this, you want your developers to be happy. Joe alluded to this. And if you talk to developers now, I mean, when I started in development in like 97, 98, it was just a given. Everybody here, I think, had the same experience. Like, it was just a given that whatever you did was like in private, you didn't own it, it was gone. Like, you left that company, all you have is like a bullet point on your resume. Yeah, or you're hiding it. Yeah, you carry it around, you show it to somebody maybe. You steal the source code, right? But like, not that I did that, okay? But the, so, and I think now that for developers today is that you want to have this public engagement, interaction, you want to be part of these communities. And so if you want to drive talent within your organizations, open source is like one of the most critical ways to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's far more than just cost of ownership. There's much more depth to it than that. So I guess, Frank, question for yourself then. Why should a bank open source some of their own code? Like, I guess I'm putting words in your own mouth. Do you think banks should open source their code? And if so,
sure.
Why?
Open source everything. No.
Yeah.
No, I think, well, let's start with the brand, right? I'm sure I didn't get hands raised up on how many people work for a bank. I wasn't looking, but I'm sure there's a majority of people in the room work for a bank. It's very hard in a bank to contribute to the industry that's outside of their doors. And I think from a brand perspective, banks can look at their employees as key instruments for advertisement in the marketplace as key technology providers. So I think let's start with brand. I think it's important. That's a hard thing to sell internally. I get that. But then we get into, okay, what are you really losing by contributing? There's great software that these companies are producing that it's very hard for them to support internally. And if they get it out to the industry, and these are not the competitive kind of things, this is straight up baseline code that means things to it's general code. Then you get it out to a community that can help you support it. So indirectly, you're getting benefit by A, getting your name out there. 2, the code that you're contributing out into the open source community is getting adoption, right? So that you're getting the support you need. And I think overall, it'll improve your ability to deliver software and services internally. So I think it's a kind of a win-win all around.
Yeah, totally agree. Just to give you guys the heads up, as I said, I'd like this to be interactive, so have a think about a few questions while I ask the last ones to the panel. So
Can I say one more point? I'm sorry.
Yeah, go
just
for
one
it.
more. So it's very hard to hire good people. Just add one more, and I forgot this, so sorry. So I'm being asked now during interviews, do you allow open source contribution in interviews now? And I'm going, wait, you just asked me a question that you would have never asked 5 years ago. So it's very important that it's very hard.
What's the answer?
So what's the answer? Of course. In my world, yes.
Very good. They're very active.
Yes, and we're very active in my company, and we understood the value of open source, and we built a process around that. So I just think it's important as you're looking to hire talent in the industry that you better have an open source policy internally. If you don't, the talent will just leave.
Yeah, but very, very true. Okay, I'm going to go for a very different topic. Gab, I had a look at one of your presentations on did cloud SaaS kill open source? And it had the subtitle, Doubts of an Open Source Fundamentalist in a Cloud Rush Era. And I thought, I don't know what that means, so I've got to ask you. What was that about?
I mean, I like to be dramatic. I'm Italian, so, I move hands.
Notice that I'm
spill
stepping
beers.
away.
That's why, you got
We gave him
gotta give me some room
I'm
here.
Italian, but I'm distancing myself.
I mean, jokes aside, I grew up in open source. I looked at proprietary software when I was out of college, and then I, quickly shut the door. I didn't like what I saw and, moved on the other side of the fence. And as I said, in the last decade, we were selling open source as a sales differentiator, especially for the consumer, especially for the, the buyer of your product. Say, hey, you're not going to be vendor locked in. So it really changed the way you would interact in your sales process with the end user. Well, then came SaaS. And at that point, you're like, well, you're not actually distributing software anymore. How is open source going to matter in this new era? Basically, have I been investing my last 15 years in wasting time? But, if you actually spin the perspective and you look at it from a vendor perspective, you realize that there will be no cloud without open source. All the cloud infrastructure is built on open source software. Try to run thousands and thousands of Windows instances on cloud. Who's going to pay the bill for that? Or even the Xen virtualization, which Amazon is based on. You made a whole bunch of examples of large SaaS providers contributing software to open source. And that's, both an element of developer engagement that I think Frank hinted to, but it's also an element of actually strategically understanding that open source is going to drive faster innovation. And so, while I started with the provocation of cloud killed open source, the conclusion is that, our future is bright and, I hope I can do more in,
Okay.
financial services.
Sorry, I would just also say maybe it's economics as well, because the cloud services are driving open source and vice versa, because those become, if open source kind of, as you move to a more open source world, services become a lot more important as an economic model.